All right, so during this week, we were going to begin a discussion of symbiosis, and we're going to focus in on parasitism and on mutualism, primarily on parasitism. But as we begin this discussion of symbiosis, and which literally means living together, sim meaning together, and biosis is life, we need to also separate parasitism from predation and even talk about some predator-prey relationships as well. So here's our outline. We'll start with a brief introduction about just what are these complex relationships that really create a very intimate, dynamic connectedness between two forms, and this form of ecology is typically described as relations or connected ecology, relational ecology, interactions ecology. So we'll talk about these complex interactions, predator-prey relationships, parasitism, and then next week we'll talk more about mutualism. Talk about exploitation and abundance of particular species, and talk about the dynamics within these relationships, what happens as prey populations plummet, what do predator populations, and how do we even predict and develop models for these. Talk about refuges or refuges that actually keep a population from going extinct in response to incredible pressure. Talk about prey density, size, and the ecology of fear, which is a really interesting discussion that we'll get to have. All right, so exploitation, interaction between populations that enhances the fitness of one individual while reducing the fitness of the exploited individual. And so there are a number of relationships that would fall under this exploitation. Predators reduce hosts or reduce the fitness of the exploited individual to zero because they kill and consume the other organisms. And here we're talking about fitness as the number of offspring that an individual produces. Parasites, they live on host tissue, meaning that they feed on host tissue, or they compete with the host for resources inside host tissue, and they reduce host fitness, but they typically don't reduce fitness to zero. There are exceptions to this. There are some parasites that will kill the host, and there are some parasites that will sterilize the host, but typically a parasite does not reduce the host fitness to zero. Parasitoids are a type of parasite. These are insect larvae that consume the host from the inside. You see this a lot with wasp species, where the wasp will lay their eggs inside of a host, and as the larvae hatch, they will begin feeding on the host. And then pathogens is just a more general term, still falls under this exploitation relationship, and these induce some kind of a disease. So a parasite could be a pathogen, although we would tend to still refer to it as a parasite, pathogens being bacteria, fungal species, viruses. So a little bit more about these complex interactions and some of the specific relationships. So some of these parasites, in addition to reducing host fitness and impacting the host, they actually will alter host behavior. Oftentimes, when we see this happen, it's in order to help increase the number of hosts consumed by the next host in the parasite's life cycle. Many of these parasites have very complex life cycles that involve multiple hosts, and so in order to finish their life cycle, they need to ensure that they get to the next host. Many of these parasites will change the behavior. For example, we've got this group of animals known as acanthocephalans, or spring-headed worms. And so this infects amphipods, a crustacean, marine and freshwater crustacean, and it makes these amphipods behave in strange ways. And basically what they do is instead of being photophobic, they become photophilic and actually love light, and so it causes them to enter more into shallow waters where they are more easily recognized and more readily fed on by predators. And so Here you can see a similar. This is an acanthocephalin as well. Plagiorhynchus is a different. It's a genus of acanthocephalin. So here's the final host for the parasite, this bird, and so the bird releases the eggs of this parasite in its feces. This terrestrial isopod, another crustacean group, eats the feces and consumes eggs of Plagiorhynchus. The eggs hatch, and now they're in their first host, and they develop to a certain developmental stage. But in order to complete their development and reach sexual maturity, they have to enter the final host, which is, of course, the bird. And so what they'll do is they'll induce a shift in behavior in the isopods, and it again will cause these isopods to seek out light. Instead of being photophobic, they become photophilic, and they seek out light where they are more easily preyed on than uninfected individuals. So when we're talking about exploitation, where one species benefits and the other is harmed, we have to distinguish this from competition. In competition, both individuals have the potential to benefit and to be harmed. But what's interesting is we oftentimes get scenarios where both are at play. And so here we've got a protozoan parasite, Adelene tribolei, that actually infects a genus of flower beetles, Tribolium. And what it does is it shifts the competitive advantage a bit. And so let's talk about this. So Adelina, this genus, it lives as a intercellular parasite, meaning that it lives in the space in between cells, and sometimes will live in the hemosyl of these insects. And so it takes what is typically the best competitor, which is Tribolium castaneum, and reduces its fitness to a point that the population density of Tribolium castaneum decreases, and the density of Tribolium confusum, the confused flower beetle, actually increases in response to now decreased competition from a interspecific competitor. And so here you've got an exploitative relationship in the parasite Adelina tribolii, parasitizing the Tribolium species, and actually shifts the dynamic and the competitive relationship a bit, and maybe keeps it in a better balance, and keeps Tribolium castaneum from forcing Tribolium confusum into extinction or extirpation in particular areas. So now we need to start to talk about modeling, and as we talk about modeling, probably our best example of this is snowshoe hares and lynx. And so snowshoe hares, Lepus americanus or americanus, and then the lynx canadensis, have this kind of cyclical relationship that we've been studying for decades, and it's just a great example of this. Because of the value of the furs, we not only have we been studying this scientifically for a number of years, but we have data from trapping records going back even further, and so this allows us to actually build a very robust model of how this works. And so some ecologists have proposed that that these cycles are driven by other factors, abiotic factors, and but what other ecologists, and what seems to be probably the most popular idea, is that what the cycling is actually driven by overpopulation issues. And so when the hare populations get too high, disease and parasitism become a much larger issue. Diseases from bacteria and other pathogens spread more readily through really dense populations than they do through more sparse populations, and parasites also spread more easily, and the animals are forced to eat other food items because of increased competition, and maybe eat items that increase their likelihood for picking up parasites. Also, some physiological stresses at high densities due to stress, due to not having as high quality denning sites and as high quality food, and then starvation due to reduced food. And so, regardless of the cause for the plummet in these hare populations, you can see that the very specialized predator that depends on them, the lynx, actually plummets very soon after you see this plummet in the hare population. As the hare population rises, you see a subsequent rise in the lynx population as well in response to that. And so, yeah, talk a little bit about snowshoe hares. Again, we may head up to Wilderness State Park during our session, and if we do, we have a decent chance of seeing some snowshoe hares. But they live primarily in boreal forests, and that's why we have to head about as far north as we can get in the lower peninsula. They like the understory shrubs, and in winter they browse on buds and stems of shrubs and small trees, saplings from aspen and spruce. And what you find is that when these populations get incredibly dense, they can significantly reduce their food biomass. And so here you can see reducing it from 530 kilograms per hectare down to 160 kilograms per hectare, which is more than a threefold decrease in the amount of food. And so, not only that, but the shoots that are produced in response to the heavy browsing are oftentimes have higher concentrations of chemical defenses that actually makes those actually less usable by rabbits, by the hares following, not rabbits, sorry, by the hares in following seasons. And so, yeah, the lynx, classic specialist predator, eats primarily snowshoe hares. Coyotes can also play a large role, but coyotes are more generalist predators. And so the predation from the lynx can account for almost 100% of mortality in the snowshoe hares during the peak densities of the lynx. And so as the hare populations increase, the food supplies decrease, starvation and weight loss oftentimes lead to increased predation, all of which are going to decrease the hare populations. And so you see that there's really two big factors controlling hare populations, if you will. One is increased competition among the hares and increased disease, and then the other one is increased predation from the lynx. And so when we have relationships like this, it's helpful to go through the process of modeling some of these, making predictions on what's going to happen in the future. And so we have what's called the Lotka-Volterra model. And so this model assumes that the host population, the prey or host, if it's a parasite-host relationship, grows exponentially, and then that the population size has a certain peak, a certain carrying capacity that basically the growth will grow up to, and that it's limited by parasites, pathogens, and predators. And here's our formula here. We'll play around a little bit with this formula on Wednesday. And so R sub H, N sub H is the exponential growth by the host population, and it's opposed by P, our rate of parasitism or predation, N sub H, the number of hosts, and N sub P, the number of parasites and the predators. And so taking this a little bit further, we can then start to say, okay, well, what about the growth rate of the parasite and the predator, not of the host or of the prey item, but of actually the parasite and the predator. And this is going to be determined by converting how much of their food actually converts into offspring, and then minus the mortality rate. And so here you've got this factor CP N sub H N sub P, which is the conversion rates of hosts into offspring. So how much of the host or their prey items that they feed on do they actually convert into offspring? And so just the portion P N sub H N sub P rate at which exploiters destroy hosts and then C is the conversion factor. And again, we'll play around with those models on Wednesday and help you get a little bit more familiar with how those models work. So the host exponential growth or prey exponential growth is exposed by these exploitation relationships. So host reproduction immediately translated into destruction by the predator. As the host population reproduces or the prey population reproduces, the predator has more to feed on. Increased predation equals more predators, and then more predators equals a higher exploitation rate. So as the host experiences success, reproductive success, the predator has more food and more opportunity to feed, which is going to allow the predator to have more offspring, and then the more predator offspring, the higher the exploitation rate. And so the larger predator population eventually reduces the host population or the prey population, which then in turn reduces the predator population. This, of course, is only true for specialist predators like the lynx. More generalist predators are just going to shift their diet and shift their feeding to another food source when one loses availability. And so, yeah, I mean, basically you get these reciprocal effects. As one increases, so does the other, but then as one increases, as the predator increases, the prey drops. And so what you get is this oscillation. And so the Lolta-Volterra model assumes that these oscillations are going to continue forever, but which is obviously unrealistic because at a certain point, the population or the prey may go extinct, or they can't get beyond a certain point due to other impacts, disease, competition with other species. But it does actually provide us a very powerful tool for protecting what's going to happen in the population of one animal in response to what's going on in another animal species. And so here you can see the Lolta-Volterra model predicting that as the prey population hits a peak, predator population is going to start to grow. As that grows, the prey population is going to shrink in response to increased predation, and so on and so forth. And what's interesting is if we eliminate the time, you get this very elliptical oscillation of predator and prey numbers. All right, so Uchida tested these models out in the laboratory using bean weevils, Calosobrochus chinensis or chinensis, and found out that you actually do see these reciprocal interactions, these elliptical responses. Gauss found similar patterns in gosh, why am I blanking on this P aurelia, Paramecium aurelia. Most laboratory experiments that try to model this fail because one of the populations goes extinct within a relatively short period of time. And so what you come to wonder is why doesn't one of the populations go extinct in the snowshoe hare and the lynx model? And so what it clues us into, and what it clued us into in ecology, is there must be some kind of a refuge. There must be these refuges in place in order for the population to keep from going to extinct. So in the face of exploitations, hosts and prey need some kind of a refuge in order to keep from going extinct. And so Gauss redid this again, Paramecium caudatum and Didinium nasudum, which feeds on Paramecium. And Didinium quickly consumed all of the Paramecium, and then the Paramecium went extinct, and then both populations go extinct. But when he added some sediment to the setup, allowing a place for Paramecium to hide and to find refuge, what you get is that a few of the Paramecium survive, and the didiniums still go extinct, but the parameciums survive. And then so that makes you wonder. So here's in the absence of refuges, the prey explode, the predator explode, and as they grow, the prey species decrease, prey goes extinct, predator goes extinct following. Here's adding a refuge. The paramecium continue to survive in small numbers by hiding in places where the predators can't find. Predators still go extinct. However, what we see in the hare and the snowshoe, or the snowshoe hare and the lynx, is that you don't have this, that you keep this oscillation going. And so what it clues us into is that these predators must be coming from some source population, coming in and continuing to repopulate, and that's what allows the predator population to keep from going extinct. And so, now we need to talk about some things that hosts and prey do in response to this exploitation. This applies for both prey and for hosts. Many of these concepts do. And so first thing is living in a large group provides a refuge. Even if there's nowhere, say, sediment to hide in, there you can hide among large groups. So what predators do in response to increased prey density is a matter of, we can figure out the number of prey consumed divided by predator times the number of predators per area is equal to the number of prey consumed per area. And predators sometimes will get confused in the presence of large numbers of prey, and even if they don't get confused, some of them can get overwhelmed or mobbed by prey, or you could just reduce the likelihood that you are eaten by hiding among a number of your peers. And so, prey can reduce the individual probability of being eaten, while the overall success of the predators may increase. The individual probability is going to decrease living in large numbers. We call this selfish herding, or under other various names. So we could see this happening with periodical cicadas, Magus cicada species. They emerge every 13 to 17 years. Their densities can approach 4 million individuals per hectare. And Williams estimated that there were 1.063 million cicadas in a 16-hectare study site, and 50% emerged during 4 consecutive nights in a very short amount of time. And the losses to birds was only 15% of the individuals that were produced. And so it's a significant way to reduce individual probability. Another way of seeking refuge, even if you're not actually hiding in sediment, is just to be large. So large individuals tend to be ignored by predators. So Pekarsky and other ecologists have seen this in small animals like mayflies, and they'll make themselves look larger in response to predation and try to remove the predatory weight and pressure, but this size, it's not a perfect solution to every problem. You can't just grow and grow and grow, because in terms of foraging, the larger you get, the lower the profitability is of every foraging experience. So size is balanced on both ends. Larger animals are harder to eat, but the larger you are, the less optimally you forage, and the more complicated it is to meet your energetic demands. So also presence of predators may alter the behavior, where prey will begin to avoid high-risk locations. They will become what's called risk-averse, and they will avoid risky decisions. This is called the ecology of fear. And so some ecologists have studied this in elk populations in Yellowstone National Park. And what they find is that elk are more vulnerable in riparian areas around creeks and rivers that are out in the open. And so they have started spending less and less time in those areas the higher the wolf population gets. And so now the elk are spending more time in the forested areas and less time out in the open. And so here you can see a wolf pack that's been introduced to Yellowstone and followed heavily. Here are elk in a riparian area. You can see this body of water right here, this creek, and here are the more wooded areas that the elk are in now, which is good for the elk, but is complicated for the ecologists and managers that are studying the elk populations, now having a harder time finding those elk now that they are spending less time in the open to avoid predation.